For the past decade, not much has happened when it comes to an affordable national housing strategy in Canada. But housing advocates are cautiously optimistic that's about to change, given the election of the new Liberal government in Ottawa and sympathetic governments at Queen's Park and at big city halls. Should they be? Well, let's find out. From Mitchell Cohen, he's president of the Daniels Corporation, and Nancy Singer, executive director of the Kahila Residential Program. And it's good to have you two here at TVO with us tonight. When, Mitchell, they talk about a national housing strategy, what exactly does that mean?
I just want to go back for a moment and say that it's actually been about 3 decades. 1984 was when the last national housing strategy kind of was terminated. There was a strategy from 1973 to 1984, but in 1984, that was the end of a national discussion about housing. So it's not 10 years, it's about 30 years.
So you can't just blame this one all on Harper. It goes back before that.
This goes back a long time. It's been decades, in fact, since there's been a discussion about a national housing strategy.
Which means what?
Well, it means that we look at our community, Canada. We look at all citizens of Canada and we say, what is a priority for all of us as Canadians? So in my view, and I think this is now shared by many, many advocates across the country, that housing a safe and secure place to call home is truly a fundamental building block of what can be a healthy community, a healthy society. And we haven't had that as a basic underlying principle for all of us as Canadians. So a national housing strategy starts with a principle that everybody has the right to a safe and secure place to call home. That's the overriding sort of thing about a national housing strategy or policy. From there, it then comes down into implementation. You know, with a great principle, it's one thing, and it's good to have that dialogue across the country. But without an implementation strategy, it's not worth anything. So the implementation strategy is dependent on funding, a long-term sustainable funding strategy. So it's okay to have the principle, that's a good starting point, but without the funding, then it's worth nothing.
We'll follow up on that funding angle in a second. But my hunch is that if you were to say to Canadians, do you think Medicare, do you think healthcare is a fundamental tenet of what it is to be Canadian? People would say yes. I'm not sure, Nancy, they'd say the same thing about what was just said. I'm not sure they'd see housing in the same respect. Is that a mistake?
Clearly it is, because people who are experiencing unaffordable housing, and there are many across the country, would say something quite differently, because they're feeling the impact of what it's like to live in big cities and to live not being able to put food on the table, not being able to pay for the basic necessities. They are really suffering, and they've suffered for a long time. As Mitch pointed out, we haven't had serious funding in a really long time. We've kind of been starved out of the business. So I think it's, in terms of Medicare, one of the interesting points, I think what people don't realize is that affordable housing is an opportunity and a solution. It's not always a problem, and we always think of it as a problem.
What's it a solution to?
It's a solution to what you just said, but healthcare. It can reduce healthcare costs. We know the costs of, overnight stays in emergency situations in hospitals, even in shelters, are much more than the cost of permanent housing. So to me, it's an opportunity, and we have to look at it in a much more positive way. It also reduces crime if people are housed safely in secure neighborhoods. So it has a positive impact. Education. Kids stay in school longer if they're, and they can learn better if they're housed and fed appropriately.
So do you, I don't know, are there studies out there which conclusively indicate?
There are.
Yes?
There have been many.
You spend more on housing, you will spend less on health care, on jails, et cetera.
There are many studies. The problem is we don't pay attention to them. And governments should, because it impacts on their budgets.
I was going to say, it's not that we don't pay attention. Who doesn't pay attention?
The governments who have budgets and want to cut costs. Actually, I think housing can be a very efficient way of dealing with some of our tax problems.
Mitchell, you're a private sector guy. Why can't we just leave it to the private sector to solve this problem?
I think we've seen over the past 3 decades that doesn't happen. It won't happen on its own. Just leaving it to the market won't create or really respond to the needs in our communities for affordable housing. We've now had 3 decades to show us that that's the case. The result of that is that there are hundreds of thousands of people in need of affordable housing. There are 35,000 people every day that are homeless, that have no place to have a home. They don't have a home in Canada every single day.
35,000 people in the country.
In the country.
Every day.
That's right. In Ontario alone, there are 168,000 people on waiting lists for affordable housing. So the proof is there in terms of leaving it to the private sector doesn't work.
Why do you think the private sector doesn't respond?
The Private sector is looking to respond to market conditions. If market is strong, the private sector will build condominiums. The private sector will look to its bottom line as a business to build housing that won't be affordable. Now, it's up, I believe, to government to intervene. So we have long been, and I'm not sure how you feel about this, Nancy, in favor of inclusionary zoning.
Which means what?
It means that every single community that gets built, let's say Toronto or in Ontario, there have been tens of thousands of units of housing that have been built over the last many, many years. We've seen it. The boom is still going. There is no requirement whatsoever for affordable housing to be built in any way, shape, or form to the housing that gets built. Inclusionary zoning requires an affordable housing component in every new community.
Can I just understand how that would work? So, for example, private company X wants to build a new 200-unit condominium at Yonge and Eglinton in the middle of Toronto.
Yeah.
You don't get the green light to build that unless what percentage of the units in there are considered affordable?
Not determined yet, but it's somewhere between 10 and 20%. I mean, if there is an inclusionary zoning bylaw, it would likely be between 10 and 20%.
You like this idea?
In fact, we created a similar idea with Adam Vaughan as a champion under Section 37.
Of what?
Oh, let's not talk jargon. Okay, under planning rules.
Okay.
What you can and can't do. And pretty much the Planning Act says you can do this and you can't do this. What we couldn't do is that condos were not considered affordable purpose rental, which is the only way that you could access funding programs and certain incentives that are available to affordable housing. And so we argued that, and we were able to have 4 condo units with a willing developer, it was Great Gulf at the time, to deed us 4 units, and 2 were family size, in a brand new condominium downtown on King Street.
4 units out of how many?
314.
That's pretty small.
It's very small.
But
it's not enough. Not enough. But my point is that if
But it's something, I guess.
Yes, and because of what we did, the legislation changed, and all nonprofits could benefit from it, and the incentives and developers. But you have to have a willing developer, a willing a nonprofit, and a willing city councillor, because it's on a long list of other community needs under Section 37. Sorry to use that term again, but what it means is you can get daycare, you can get parks, you can get art. So you're competing, so you're always competing.
But Mitchell, let me make sure I understand how this would work. Again, let's take our fictitious 200-unit building at Yonge and Eglinton here in Toronto. Let's say 10% of the units are going to be so-called affordable.
Sure.
Does that require then some government to subsidize the rents of the people who are going to live in there, or subsidize the cost of purchase of the people who are going to live in there? Is that how it works?
It would be a real collaboration between private sector and public sector. So the private sector says, yes, we're going to do 20 units in this community that will be affordable. So then it's a question of how deeply affordable. The private sector would say, okay, we're prepared to do affordable ownership within that building and provide second mortgages, as we do in many of the communities that we do. Regent Park, that you've been down to take a look at, for example, there's a down payment assistance program to create affordable ownership housing. So that's one vehicle. The other is affordable rental. And to get truly deep affordable rental will need government support. The key thing is that it's a jurisdictional thing, that it's not just based on, we hope the private sector will create affordable housing. It's like way back, there was a moment in time when all of the cars we drove had no emission controls. And the auto industry said, oh my God, we can't afford emission controls. We're not going to do emission controls until legislation demanded emission controls. And the next day, everybody had to do it. There's another great example here in Ontario. It's the Greenbelt and the Places to Grow Act. I mean, the developers in the 905s were very much opposed to the Greenbelt legislation that says you can't build within this piece of land. And when you build in places to grow that are designated, you have to build intensified, higher density housing. So up until the day the legislation changed, the development industry said no, 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 no. However, the day the legislation changed, everyone realized this is the new game. It's a level playing field. Everybody now has to build more intensified development, and everybody learned to do it. All the developers said, okay, now we have to do it.
So they object initially to the government meddling in their business, but once the rules are set,
they adapt.
People play ball.
Absolutely. Just on that note, I mean, developers are very entrepreneurial, and if the rules are laid out and it's a level playing field for everybody, everybody plays, and everybody would then provide affordable housing.
Here's the skeptic in me, okay? Here, not cynic, but I'm just...
Skepticism is good.
What would prevent It's a terrible example. You forgive me here, but here we go, okay? What would prevent somebody from getting in there and taking a so-called affordable unit in our new fictitious condo or apartment building, and then the next day flipping it at a market rate or subleasing it to somebody at a market rate and pocketing the difference? Because that will happen.
Yeah. I guess you're probably using Vancouver a bit as an example right now, but in a different way in the real estate market. But no, there are controls in place. And in any of the programs that we administer, whether it's a rent allowance, a rent supplement, or in terms of affordable homeownership, there are controls that there are agreements that have to be signed. There is a monitoring process.
Because I hate to think you'd go through all this and then at the end of the day people cheat and you're no further ahead.
No, I mean, there's income vetting. And in terms of rent subsidy, the people that Mitch just referred to, the 168,000, there's a review process, and you basically, all your incomes and all your assets or lack of assets are put on the table.
Mitchell, I don't know if we can walk and chew gum at the same time on this file, so I want to ask you what's a higher priority. Because I hear the numbers you're giving, which are huge, about the number of people who are either poorly housed or underhoused, etc. I also hear the mayor of Ontario's capital city saying, we have stock in this city that is crumbling and falling apart, and if we have $1 billion burning a hole in our pocket, we should actually fix what we've got first before we start thinking about building something else. What do we do?
Totally agree.
Well, agree what? Which way do we go?
The crumbling housing stock has to be addressed right now. So ideally, I mean, we're all hearing that the federal government is about to launch their budget towards the end of March. We've been hearing, like, very positive signs that social infrastructure is now a new buzzword, and it's a very important thing. It's an understanding that an investment in housing and in that crumbling infrastructure will be a very sound investment that will reap great payback. So we're at a point now where infrastructure spending is more than simply bridges and roads and sewers, but actually housing. So I think the first phase of this investment, because it can happen immediately, so it solves a whole bunch of things. It puts people to work tomorrow morning. So that investment in the crumbling infrastructure in terms of social housing, absolutely essential, important, should happen tomorrow. It's that longer term sustainable funding for building new housing that is going to address the 168,000 people on the waiting list in Ontario.
Which gets us now, Nancy, to the reason why so many people are optimistic right now, and let's find out if they should be. Justin Trudeau's come into power, pledging to do more. We know Premier Wynne at Queen's Park is simpatico. John Tory, the mayor of Toronto, also says he's simpatico. So for the first time in a long time, you've got three levels of government essentially all on the same page in terms of their recognition of needing to do something. When do you expect the manna to start falling from heaven?
I'd like to say tomorrow, about two budgets are due, the provincial one and the federal one. And I did have a conversation with Adam Vaughan yesterday, and
he's one of the MPs in downtown Toronto.
He is, and he is also, he's a parliamentary assistant for intergovernmental affairs now to the Prime Minister. So he's in a very pivotal position, and he has a clear understanding of the urban areas as well as of housing.
What's he told you?
He's been an advocate of housing. Okay, so three things are going to land. There will be the money. There'll be the $20 billion that we've heard about, but that's over 10 years. So once you start breaking down that amount of money, we're talking $2 billion a year.
For the whole country?
For the whole country, so don't get too excited. And maybe we're talking about 3,000 units across the country. In Toronto itself, it could come out to 300 to 600 units, and that's based on half the money going to building repair and the other half going to new building, and actually even less than that, because a portion of that would probably go to housing allowances, what we talked about, bridging the gap between affordable rents and really subsidized rents. So we can spend that money really quickly, and we may not make that much of a dent. So we need a lot more. We need different types of innovations and partnerships. It's not just about that one check coming down. That's not going to solve the problem. But at the city level, you have a mayor who's on board, you have a chief planner who gets it and supports inclusionary zoning. But that has to be dictated from the province. We have to wait for the appropriate legislation to be passed, and that may or may not happen. But you have fast track, you have other incentives, deferral of development charges. All the costs that go into making a housing unit very expensive can be brought down through these various incentives.
You wouldn't want to sneer at $20 billion, but on the other hand,
we'll take the money.
But on the other hand, based on what I've just heard, it doesn't sound like it's going to go very far.
No, but there's other tools, and I think one of the foremost tools is a housing first policy. So all levels of government own land. And each level of government, the city, the province, and the feds, have been looking at land as to what land might be declared surplus to their needs. So declaration of surplus should then lead to a housing first policy that says, okay, we don't need this land for any other purpose. Let's say it's designated for housing, for affordable housing. So the city's already doing that. And now the province, we hope, are about to do that as well, looking at their inventory of land, because everything starts, in terms of new construction, it starts with land. And the assets, the public assets are there.
Absolutely.
The opportunity today for the province, for example, to demonstrate that leadership, city's doing it. Now's the opportunity for the province to demonstrate leadership by saying, here are 5, 10 pieces of land across the province. We're going to designate these as housing first and make them available to nonprofits like Kihila and others across the province to come forward, because with land that is offered at zero cost, then affordable housing can be built. The federal government can ideally layer on some of their assistance that is going to be happening, and then you're creating truly affordable housing.
You know what'll happen, though?
That will reduce healthcare costs. I mean, back to the initial point.
Okay, I hear you.
So it's an investment that will pay off for decades, for generations.
And the feds are going to put land on the table too, I've
They
been
are.
told, and some tax incentives also.
Because I'm just waiting for the question period when the opposition stands up and says, you gave away this land for nothing when we should have got, whatever, 25 million bucks for this land, and what do the taxpayers think of that? I mean, you can see this turns into a political football pretty quickly.
But it also turns into a good return.
Says you.
Well, says a sector, and economists would defend that
Steve,
position.
it's always been a political football. So, I mean, does our government have the political will today, as a majority, to declare for all, on behalf of all of us, that housing is a priority? We think that they're about to do that. That's why there's such optimism. And there's a real feeling of optimism between the different levels of government that today people are ready and willing to work together to actually address this enormous challenge that we've got.
With just a couple of minutes left here, and with you having the floor, let me get you to talk about what you did down at Regent Park, because I presume, I mean, for those who don't know, that was one of the most, I don't want to exaggerate this, but this was not a good place to live for a very long time.
Absolutely.
Part of downtown Toronto, and you and other stakeholders got in there, and I mean, it's like night and day the way it is right now. Is that a model for what you want to see going forward?
Totally. I mean, it is a model of what's referred to as a community hub. I mean, this is on 69 acres, but the same principles can be applied to a 5-acre parcel, 10-acre parcel, or a 20-acre parcel. The idea is that you're bringing together affordable housing, rental, affordable ownership, with market housing, and with social services that will support people who are living in the community. So the province is very much on board to create community hubs that build on the principles that we've established now over the past 10 years in Regent Park. So the guidelines are there. The roadmap is there today in Regent Park, and thank you for mentioning that. It's been 10 years, actually 10 years ago this week, we knocked down, in partnership with Toronto Community Housing, the first of the buildings of the old Regent Park. So it has come a long way. There's still a long way to go, but it is unfolding and really is a model for how a very stigmatized community can be transformed.
But part of what, if I understand it, what is going to make it work or not is whether people from other neighborhoods see it as a good investment and therefore decide to buy condominium units there, increasing the economic opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. Is that happening?
It is absolutely happening. I mean, the doors of Regent Park, the boundaries are no longer there. Regent Park used to be cut off from the rest of the city.
The streets didn't go through.
Physically, but also spiritually, emotionally. People would drive along Dundas Street there and they would lock their doors and roll up their windows and not stop. Very different atmosphere today. Very much a feeling of openness and people coming and using the physical assets that have been created. The Aquatic Center, the Community Center, the Daniel Spectrum that is there, as well as this amazing cultural hub. So the whole feeling has turned, and it is now part of our city and delivering value because of the public-private partnership that was created that is a model for going forward.
In our last minute here, what kind of a check would you like what politician to hand to you so you could therefore then do what?
In a dollar amount?
Yeah.
It's a tough question to answer.
For your program specifically.
Well, you know, one project would cost about $15 million to put it into context.
So if I gave you 15 million bucks, what would you do with it?
I'd build a project very quickly.
And it would be a project of what? How many units and
About 65 units.
And how many people could therefore live there?
About 85 people.
85 people?
Yeah.
And it would take how long to get done?
About 2 years, if we're fast tracking it, I'm assuming. But what I probably would want to do with a lot of that money is also housing subsidies and housing allowances. We actually have a program, ironically, that's funded by 30 private developers in the community. And that's a bit of an anomaly. It's not publicly funded, and we're assisting 70 households. And that took us less than a year to raise the money and to assist people. The last project we did, because of a lack of funding, to do exactly that took 8 years, from conception to completion.
Did you hit him up for money?
I absolutely did, and he's on board.
And he's on board? Okay, just checking.
He's definitely one of the team.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Nancy Singer, Mitchell Cohen, really good of you to come into TVO tonight and help us out with this. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.